Thank you, Dr. Onley. I think you have given us a very, comprehensive overview of the evolution of Gulf studies and its current situation. And I think one of the very interesting point which you made towards the end is the integration of Gulf studies into Indian Ocean studies, and I think that is something very significant. I remember one of the earliest, scholars who was actually basically working on Gulf and Middle East studies, but eventually started writing more within the context of Indian Ocean studies was Professor K.R. Singh, if I am not mistaken. He was earlier with the Jawaharlal Nehru University, and then he was, I think, for some time at the Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis, where I currently work. And then I think he also worked for some projects at the University of Cochin in Kerala. So I think that is something very interesting. And maybe at this point, may I request Professor Raja Mohan, who has joined us from Singapore and who is the director of Institute for South Asian Studies, and I think who also has an abiding interest in Indian Ocean studies, to perhaps come in here and give his comments.
Sorry, I think Singapore is getting dark, so you're not going to see much of me, but I'm really, just to say I'm delighted I was here to listen to Professor Onley. I think the things he's, one thing for me, someone who's not an expert in the field, but looking at India's international relations, and someone who's a product of School of International Studies, JNU, is how recent is the study of the Gulf as a discipline. I think I'm quite surprised that its origins are so recent, and that my university or my school was so central to its founding. So many of us who went through the university, but not clear that, look, it is actually what was being done was pioneering work. So that is really one thing that every time we look at the historical evolution, I think our perspective always gets much better. Second, I think on the integration with the Indian Ocean, in fact, Professor K.R. Singh was my colleague for a short while at the Institute of Defense Studies. He started out looking at these security issues and Indian Ocean debates, which was beginning at the time. And certainly after the British withdrawal from east of Suez, which was a definitive moment in thinking about the Gulf and the Indian Ocean in India. So that actually was the context in which the zone of peace and a whole lot of debates that had started in India. And of course, the energy issue, as it became more important, then the interest in India, and then the migration, all these come together. So I just want to congratulate you, Professor Onley, and I hope you'll have a chance to visit India and Singapore at some point of time to be able to, inspire a lot more people to think about this region, especially now when the Indian Ocean studies has become such a vast field, and there is a proliferation of studies on the historical evolution of the Indian Ocean. So let me stop here, and I'm so pleased that I was a chance to listen to you here today.
Thank you. You just a couple of comments, which I didn't mention in my talk, but are in the article, is the important role of India and also Singapore and the Malay Archipelago and Peninsula in the development of Gulf and Arabian Peninsula studies by Gulf and Arabian Peninsula residents, citizens. If we take a look at the publication history in Arabic of the first historians, let's say, and writers in the Gulf and in Yemen, they published in India, Singapore, Jakarta, and Cairo. And so, for example, the father of the nation here in Qatar, Sheikh Jassim Al Thani, who was also a notable poet, his book of poems, his Diwan, which came out in 1911, was published in Bombay. And so India, as well as Indonesia and Singapore, were a forum for intellectual debate amongst the Arab diaspora, amongst the Arab writers. A good example of this is the founding historian in Kuwait, who in the 1930s left Kuwait and moved to Jakarta where he founded a journal in Gulf studies and published in Arabic in 1931. So the incorporation of the Gulf and the Arabian Peninsula in Indian Ocean studies was first embraced by the writers in the Arabian Peninsula itself, and then secondly by scholars in India. So the first writers on how the Gulf and Arabian Peninsula form part of the wider Indian Ocean was first written about really by Indian scholars who you know, it's self-evident from India, of course, but globally these links were forgotten by the 1970s because of the declining links between India and South Asia and the Arabian Peninsula studies after partition in 1947, Indian and Pakistani independence. And then the economic shift of the GCC states away from Asia more broadly towards the Arab world in the West, the Arab nationalism, all of this. And then after about one generation, people had forgotten of the deep historical and social and cultural and economic links between the Arabian Peninsula and India and Asia more broadly. And as now we're only rediscovering these thanks to the government policies, the Gulf's rediscovery, the GCC's rediscovery that it is a part of Asia. For generations in the GCC states here in Qatar, if you ask where is Qatar, people would say it's in the Middle East. And if you say, well, it's in Asia, no, it's in the Middle East. There's not a realization that we're in West Asia here, or that we're in Asia at all. There's, you know, they don't even refer to West Asia. If you ask somebody in Qatar, where's West Asia, they would think Pakistan. So the waking up of the fact that the Arabian Peninsula is a part of Asia and has these deep historical roots is now being reflected in the scholarship, but also in government policies. We see all of the governments now re-engaging with Asia, mainly India and China, and we're seeing a pivot away from the Arab world and the West back towards Asia, which is not a new policy, but a return to the old status quo that has been in place for millennia.
Thank you, Dr. Onley. We have Ambassador Sanjay Singh also with us. Sir, would you like to make a comment? Any question?
Thank you. I am delighted to listen to you, Professor Onley, and listen to your lecture. And it's a correct way to begin the MEI program for the year when there are so many young scholars listening in, because Gulf Studies has got tremendous future, tremendous scope. And it has such a lot of material waiting there to be looked at, to be researched, to, especially in India, given a huge connection. I have been a practitioner. I've been in the Indian Foreign Office, and I really haven't done any research. But I've come across an enormous amount of wealth of material about India's connection with the Gulf. And these have been picked up through various records left by, for example, pearl traders who used to go between Basra in India, Qatar, Doha in India, and people who used to come and then pick up salt from India and take it to the Gulf. Then there is an enormous amount of record of material waiting to be researched by young scholars who are present here today on given the connection that we had under the Hajj pilgrimage. And the British Foreign Office has a huge record based on what their consul in Jeddah used to write, and based on what their consul in Aden used to write, and what their consul in Bushehr used to write. And I've come across some of these writings, and one of the most fascinating ones was that the vice consul in Jeddah, sometimes in 1890s, this is just I recall reading it, had been murdered because he was trying to put in some honesty into the system. And so the British sent a gunboat into Jeddah. And this was to look after the Indian Hajj pilgrims. then there is an enormous amount of wealth of material in India waiting to be discovered in areas like Hyderabad, Rampur, Tonk, who used to have rubats in the Hejaz region. And they used to keep on sending records from the Hejaz about what has been happening in that area for the last 500 years or so.
Mhm.
So I'm so glad you're firing everybody's mind into this. And I hope in Qatar, in the National Museum, there will now be in future a huge archive of these materials which will be collected and kept. I've seen a lot of material from India going there. I believe the original Quran written by, I think, Aurangzeb is presently being exhibited there in Qatar, if I'm not mistaken. So more power to your hands, more power to your shoulders. And if you can collect material, especially about a connection, say, between Oman and India, Oman, Zanzibar, as in the context of studies, and how the Gulf traders have taken things through the Cochin, through Malabar coast and on to Southeast Asia, it'd be fascinating. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Not sort of related, but not on topic of this particular article, is an exhibition I organized last year called Qatar, India, and the Gulf, and it was it examined nearly 5,000 years of connections between the Gulf and South Asia, and it looked at the full spectrum. And this culminates, of course, in the during the Estado de India with the Portuguese Empire in India, which incorporated parts of the Arabian Peninsula into the Portuguese Indian Empire, and then later the British Indian Empire, which many parts of the Arabian Peninsula were constitutionally a part of, although not formally recognized. They were nonetheless a part of, just as much a part of the Indian Empire as, say, Hyderabad. I've written about this. This was, of course, the subject of my book, The Arabian Frontier, the British Raj, and some other publications. But these political manifestations were based on much deeper economic, cultural, financial connections. So the Arabian Peninsula was largely a dependency of India, economic dependency. The pearling trade here was completely financed by Indian, mainly Hindu financiers. Without India, the Gulf couldn't have operated, any large-scale economic activity, such as the import-export industry or pearling. So India was absolutely critical, and this is symbolized by the fact that the local currency used here in the Gulf, in the GCC states, up until the 1960s, was the Indian rupee. It was the official currency.
Thank you, sir, and thank you, Dr. Onley, for your response. May I now request Professor Kishishian to have his comments or question, if any?
Thank you, Muddassir. Delightful presentation, Professor Onley. I look forward to reading the essay. And I hope that in the essay, there is also a focus on the numerous centers that have now come up and working throughout the Gulf countries. Of course, more in Saudi Arabia than elsewhere, but there is now a variety to choose from. Now, I have actually two separate questions, but I will try to tie them together as much as possible. In your presentation, you correctly stated that the interest in the Gulf states did not really take off until the 1970s and late 70s, essentially, perhaps associated with the oil crisis that occurred in the 1974 war. I remember when I started teaching, of course, I don't do that anymore, but when I started teaching a long time ago, I taught courses on the Gulf states at University of Virginia, at Pepperdine University, and I had lots of students who were very much interested. But as you said in your presentation, most of these students were interested in the political side because they wanted to have careers in government and they wanted to either focus on the economy because they were hoping to get jobs with oil companies and so on and so forth. and much less on other areas that are far more perhaps accessible, because less political means more accessibility in the Gulf, as you know very well.
Mm-hmm.
But that's my first question. The fact that this accessibility question in the Gulf countries is a big dilemma. Now, you know, I'm very fortunate. I've always been very lucky to have had good access, but I know that it's very difficult, and a lot of my colleagues have not had that kind of access. What can be done? The first question is this: what can be done to actually improve the access that scholars need in order to conduct their research? Could one possible avenue be to work in cooperation with local scholars who will presumably have better chances of having access? And the second question, unrelated, but somewhat, let's make it related because I think it's really what we want to focus on, is where are we going in terms of future research? It's good that for 5,000 years we've been looking at the Arabian Peninsula, and when oil dries and the Gulf countries are no longer vital to the Western economies, what kind of interest would scholars have, except for a few Germans who will resuscitate and come back? What kind of interest will future scholars have on the Arabian Peninsula? Now, you, in your presentation, had a brilliant link, which I really appreciate, that is to tie the Gulf states with the Indian Ocean. I think that's one very sure avenue to continue. But is that enough? Indian Ocean is important in its own right, and the Gulf states are important in their own right. And you know, we want to make the link, but at the same time, we don't want to make it so confusing that we are denying some kind of primacy to the Arabian Peninsula. I think that the Arabian Peninsula deserves to stand on its own 2 feet, although I think that linking it with the Indian Ocean and studies in the Indian Ocean is very, very useful. But my second question to you, therefore, is what does the future look like to you? How do you see the progress, and whether or not we can encourage young people? I mean, someone like me, I'm at the end of my career, 3-4 more years and I'll hang my hat. But young people need to figure out where they're going to go, what kind of future they're going to have, what kind of research can they do, and what needs to be created as incentives to encourage them to get into this line. Sorry, I went on too long, but you get my drift.
Great. Well, I'll see if I can. I think I've understood your question. So the first one is, how do we improve access? Well, certainly, how can one outside of the Gulf region work on the Gulf? The answer, of course, is that you obviously need some sort of a connection, some sort of entry point to come here. Now, thanks to things like the Qatar Digital Library, and you don't have to for some things, you can just do it from the comfort of your own home. So that's opened up a new avenue. And the increasing amount of availability of primary source material online is really helping promote scholarship. And why does things like the QDL matter? Because it allows you to transcend the traditional archive, where you would go, for example, to the National Archive of India or the British Library in London, and then you would order up the catalog, and then you would look through the long list of file titles till you found what you wanted. Then you'd order it up, and then you would have to look page by page through that document to find what you're looking for. That would take you weeks, months to do, including the prep time, very expensive, buying tickets, hotel room, all of that. And with the Qatar Digital Library, now you can use keyword searches, and you can find the exact page and the exact document you're looking for within 5 seconds. So you can then transcend the file titles, if you call it the tyranny of the file title, which will tell you that this file is on, I don't know, let's say affairs in gutter, right? And it doesn't tell you anything more than that. But within the file, it tells you about specific things, specific people that you would never find on your own. And you can begin to see these connections. If you're looking, for example, for an individual, you can find a tremendous amount of material very quickly. Even things that were not the intention of the record keepers, because these records, the ones that are most people use, were created, by empires, by the British, by the Portuguese, for the purpose of trade and imperial control. But if you're, let's say, an environmental historian and you're interested in earthquakes, well, now you can access this material and see all of these reports about earthquakes. It's not in the file title, but you can now put together a chronology of all of the earthquakes in the 19th century that occurred around the Gulf region, thanks to the Qatar Digital Library. So, but locally, yes, you need to have an affiliation, but thanks to the increasing global outlook of not only the national universities here, but also these international universities, mostly American affiliated universities, you can become a visiting professor. You can come here, as a visiting fellow, or you can come here for a conference or something like, or you can get a research grant and then come here and then be affiliated with an institution where you can hang your hat while you do your work. So that access wasn't there before the 21st century. It was very hard. There were a few exceptions, but on the whole, very, very hard. So I encourage you to scan the horizon for events here. Georgetown University, for example, has an annual Indian Ocean Conference. And they invite scholars from everywhere. The one we had here in February last year, there were many scholars from India who came out and gave papers. So that's one avenue. And sometimes because they have a budget for this, they'll pay for your ticket. So I think all the scholars who came here had their airfare and hotel covered by Georgetown University. And once you're here, then you can talk with colleagues and say, listen, I'm working on this too. Why don't we collaborate together on a piece? Sometimes professors at state-run universities, although the teaching loads are lower than they used to be, they still don't have enough time for research. So a collaborative approach, writing something with a professor, in your field, would be a way to do that. So I, for example, a number of years ago, did that with a colleague in Muscat. We wrote a study of the Hindu community in Muscat today, based on a continuation of Calvin Alvin's a famous study, a historical study of the Hindu community there. And I never went to Oman to do that study. I did it with my co-author, who's based at Sultan Qaboos University. And then she did the field work, and then she wrote it up, and then I reworked it. I reviewed the literature, and then we added more in. And in this way, we were able to produce something that neither of us could have done on our own. So I highly encourage you to reach out to academics here in the Arabian Peninsula and suggest collaborative projects like that. That's a win-win, I think, for everybody. When it comes to future patterns and developments, I think there's basically two things going on that you'll begin to see. One, if you liken the Eastern Arabia to a map, and to the age of discovery. For example, I'm from Vancouver, so if you take a look at old maps in the time of Captain Cook when he was exploring the west coast of the Americas, when he first arrived there, it was largely blank. There was just a straight line. They had no idea what was there. And then slowly he and then his successors began to fill it in, and we began to see the contours of the west coast of North America over time. Well, it's the same here with the Eastern Arabia, but in the academic field. So we still do not have a foundational text on the history of this, that, and the other thing for many areas. We still don't have a proper, detailed chronological history of Qatar. There are some books out there, but they're not comprehensive enough. One of them, the most recent one, largely subscribes to the national narrative, which is promoted by the government, which leaves out all of the difficult bits that the government doesn't want you to know about. So I think that there's a lot of blank spaces yet to be filled in. So as a PhD student or as a scholar working on another part of the world and now shifting to the Gulf, you can pick almost any topic, and chances are nobody's written on it yet. The other thing is the incorporation of Gulf studies and debates within Gulf studies into larger debates. So in my own field, for my book, The Arabian Frontier, the British Raj, I discovered that the history of British involvement in the Gulf was completely divorced from larger debates about the British Empire and imperialism. And so you could say that for every other field too: political science, anthropology, diaspora studies, migration studies, identity studies. So I think you'll begin to see the incorporation of Arabian Peninsula studies, Gulf studies into these larger debates within all these other different disciplines to see how that is. And within Middle Eastern studies as well, I think you'll begin to see the appearance of the Arabian Peninsula into these broader narratives about the history, for example, of the Ottoman Empire. The Gulf is largely ignored. It's a footnote in the history of the Ottoman Empire. But in future, I would hope to see a greater incorporation of it. There was a pioneering work by Fred Anscombe called The Ottoman Gulf that got the ball rolling on that. But if you read mainstream histories of the Ottoman Empire, the Arabian Peninsula is not mentioned. So I think you'll see that in future. And finally, I think that it's probably the easiest part of the Middle East to work on. If we were to compare this with other fields in the Middle East, which are heavily trodden ground. If you work on any other part of the Middle East, there's so much literature to review before you begin working. In the Gulf, your literature review could be 1 page in some cases, because nobody's written on this. There's related works in other areas, but nobody's written in this area. So I think just in terms of the ease of it all, Gulf studies is an open field. It's like if you're in development and you're building new housing development, just go to an area where there's nothing, there's nobody there, so you don't have to go through the problems of having to buy up all the existing property and getting housing permission and all of that. You just go to an area where there's nothing and you start from scratch. So I think that's another attraction, a main attraction to Gulf studies.
Thank you, Dr. Onley. I think that is very encouraging for all the young scholars, including me, to kind of, and motivation to kind of continue working on Gulf studies. May I now request Professor Rama, just before that, I mean, we have a couple of more questions. If we can take 10 minutes of, extend it to another 10 minutes. So maybe, sir, Ramakrishnan, sir.
Great to see you.
Great meeting you here, and it was a very good presentation where all these interrelated concern regarding the Gulf studies and Arabian Peninsula studies are brought forth. My question would be the overlapping concerns of Gulf studies on the one hand and Arabian Peninsula studies on the other, because the historical trajectories of these two regions as an academic, in the academic disciplinary format were not the same. Not only because if we talk about Gulf studies, the other side of the Gulf, Iran, Iraq, and so on, and if it's in the Gulf studies, Yemen, etc., is still a kind of geographical kind of question. But in the epistemological sense, the historians, the anthropologists, and others have had greater interest in the Arabian Peninsula as such, where political scientists, economists, and others had much more interest in the Gulf studies, and people of the strategic community, people studying about resources like oil, etc. They had Gulf studies in focus. For others, it was Arabian Peninsula, for historians especially. So, what is your take on the overlapping features of these two domains of concern, and what are the divergences that you could find in maintaining these two terms and then connecting them together?
I'll try to answer your question if I think I understand it. Is your question when we're saying Gulf and Arabian Peninsula studies, where on the map are we talking about?
No, on the history of in concerns of the knowledge community in these two specific terminologies themselves, Gulf studies and Arabian Peninsula studies.
Okay,
because different sets of people looked at them from very different points of view.
Yeah.
And from different disciplinary backgrounds as well.
No, you're right. Thank you for pointing this out. I wanted to include a definition of these different terms in the article, but Gerd, my co-author, said, we're just going to open a Pandora's box because the definitions are multiple. But I did write a series of definitions so that we could have a clear idea when we look at these, for example, these centers. You'll see some centers are called the Center for Persian Gulf Studies, or the Center for Arab Gulf Studies, or the Center for Gulf Studies, or the Center for Arab and Arabian Peninsula Studies. And when you took a look at their activities and their publications, they include different groups of people. And then on top of that, there's the intellectual divide that we see between the Arabian Peninsula, those who work on the Indian Ocean side, and those who work on the Persian Gulf side. And these two groups are largely separate. People who work on Yemen don't work on Kuwait. And people who work on Kuwait don't read the literature on Yemen. And they don't see people necessarily who work on Yemen as fellow, an area of a subfield within Middle Eastern studies necessarily. But so this is what I've discovered, but it's not in the article. The development of Arabian Peninsula studies as a whole has only emerged, and perhaps is only just now emerging, and maybe hasn't yet emerged, because we do not see the integration of Yemeni studies and Red Sea studies on the one hand with scholarship on Eastern Arabia and the Gulf region. These are still largely two separate conversations. And we're beginning to see it to an extent, but not yet. But with the formation of these centers, and now with the formation of the Association for Gulf and Arabian Peninsula Studies, AGAPS, which was founded at the same time as the Journal of Arabian Studies, we're seeking to create a space for that dialogue to happen. So we publish, for example, if you take a look at another chart that's in the article, it looks at the number of topics that the Journal of Arabian Studies publishes on. The number one after 10 years of publications, the number 60 articles have been on the Arabian Peninsula or Gulf as a whole, the entire region as a whole. After that, the next two most popular topics were Yemen, 16 articles, and the UAE, 16 articles. So we've thoroughly integrated Yemeni studies within Arabian Peninsula studies or Gulf studies. But I think from a Yemeni studies perspective, there is a feeling that they are subordinated to Gulf studies. Now, previously, we had the Yemeni boom, Yemeni studies boom in the 70s, 80s, and it was the other way around. It was Yemeni studies that dominated Arabian Peninsula studies. You went to the annual conference at MESA, the vast majority of papers that were on the Arabian Peninsula were on Yemen. And we knew a lot about Yemen, very little about Qatar. So if we take a look, again, in the article, I quantify this. So we compare Qatar by today. I think by now there's I don't know. There's I forget the number, but there's about 80 something books in English that have been published on Qatar to date, right? Now compare that with Yemen, There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books have been published on Yemen.
Yeah.
So still Yemeni studies still eclipses Gulf studies. Now Gulf studies is now beginning to rise up, and it's now beginning to eclipse Yemeni studies. So I think there's some of that there, but we're beginning to see now an integration of the two. There's other terms as well. We have the term Gulf studies. Well, what do we mean by that? I've seen that when you take a look at centers for Gulf studies, like the one that I ran at Exeter University, it deliberately leaves out Persian or Arab. Then the primary focus is the GCC states, with a secondary focus on southern Iraq and southern Iran, or Iraq and Iran more broadly. But it's only, but GCC will always be there. And then, so it's either GCC and the region as a whole, or just the GCC. Then we have Arab Gulf studies. Now, Arab Gulf studies is basically, from what I've understood, is really GCC plus Iraq and plus Yemen. But Iraq and Yemen are optional additions, not always there. So if you see a book on the Arab Gulf, it may or may not include chapters on southern Iraq. Then we have Persian Gulf studies. And this takes Iran as the center of focus, where you may or may not have additional content on the rest of the region, that is the GCC states or Iraq. So if you look at the Center for Persian Gulf Studies at Princeton University, and you look at their activities, their conferences, for example, their conferences are only on Iran. But if you look at their lecture series, they have a few token papers on other parts of the region, like the UAE. But 90% of what they do is on Iran. Then so these are the different fields, and I think there's a certain amount of vagueness about them. We can add into this Yemeni studies and Red Sea studies. But Red Sea studies is a poor cousin of Gulf studies. For every book you have on Red Sea studies, you probably have dozens or more on the Gulf region. So these are the different areas. They each of them that includes or doesn't include sort of neighboring regions. So there's areas of overlap. It's rather vague. But I think that the vagueness is part of its attraction. It's sort of symbolic of the region as a whole, which has always been historically cosmopolitan and transnational. It's always had elements of other areas incorporated into it. For example, India, aspects of Indian culture are now, a de facto part of national culture here, like Karak chai or biryani. Right? I mean, these are national cuisines, but they're from India. So it is with Gulf studies. We sometimes have elements from the neighboring regions outside of the Arabian Peninsula. But I don't think that we have a single community, but we have a series of if you consider circles in which we have other communities that incorporate into it. And there's a certain amount of fluidity there. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, James.
Thank you.
Listening to you. Yeah.
There's, I think, one final question from Dr. Samina Hamid. Ma'am?
Yeah, thanks, Muddassir. Thank you, Dr. Onley. Very exciting conversation as always, seeing after a long time after your visit in JNU. I would like to have your comment on this aspect. There is often a politics involved in knowledge production, especially with regard to history, culture, society of the region. So how far salient is this aspect at any point in time of the evolution of studies regarding Arabian Peninsula?
Well, there's a very good book that came out a few months ago called Archive Wars, which I highly recommend to you. I'm reading it right now on Kindle, so I can't show you the physical copy of it, by an historian at Harvard University. And it looks at the politics of history and of writing of history in Saudi Arabia. And the article that when it's that Gerd and I wrote includes footnotes to this literature on the politics of history and of the challenges that face scholars. And while we give the institutional history of the formation of Gulf and Arabian Peninsula studies with the foundation of all these centers and so on, we didn't then go into the role in creating a national narrative. So all of these centers in the GCC states themselves and in Yemen were funded, the early ones were all funded by the state, and they played a key role in basically figuring out, well, what is our national story? What is the national narrative? And then publishing that for use in schools and, you know, the teaching of a new generation of citizens of what the story is. All of the GCC states, and I think normally this is a practice one sees everywhere. All of the states play a role in crafting that national narrative, so that it explains and justifies the present, and in particular why we have the government we have, why we have the social system and political system that we have, and so on. And anything that undermines that, anything that shows that there isn't a single straightforward linear sort of development to the present day is sort of edited out of the national narrative. So there's been a good amount of literature on this, a book edited by Madawi Rashid called Counter Narratives on I think mainly Saudi Arabia, looking at the alternative discourses, because within every state, they're primarily in the GCC, you have the sort of the first class citizens, those who are from the same sort of background as the ruling families, in all the GCC states except Oman. These are Arab, tribal, Sunni. So if you are not Arab, tribal, and Sunni, if your ancestry isn't in line with that, if you're, for example, your ancestors are from Iran, if you're not Sunni but Shia, or in the case of Oman, if your ancestry is Indian and Hindu. There are hundreds of Indian Omani citizens who wear the Omani national dress with the bindi. Right? So why is it that we see that in Oman, but we don't see that embracing of the transnational heritage of Oman, and where we see that in Oman, but we don't see that in the other GCC states, which were also equally transnational and cosmopolitan before the arrival of Arab nationalism in the mid-19th century. So this is an ongoing issue, but it makes it fascinating because that in itself is a subject for research, as this book Archive Wars points out. It's one subject that I myself would like to work on, is looking at these national narratives and how they shape our thinking about the region as a whole. One of the impacts of the state-sponsored national narrative for the GCC states is that I, right now here, am in a country that is in the Arab world, not in Asia, but in the Arab world. So that shapes everybody's, not just the nationals, but the expatriates, their thinking about these states. And so that's why new work, for example, the incorporation of the Gulf into Indian Ocean studies, helps break down these barriers, these blinders in how we're understanding the region. You can't do that in every GCC state. In Qatar, you can. For this Indian exhibition that I organized last year, called Qatar, India, and the Gulf, what was it? History, Heritage, and Society, looking at nearly 5,000 years of connections. I basically argued in that the Gulf region was a part of the Indian world. In the same way, if we look at Persianate studies, and we look at how Mughal India, Central Asia was a part of a larger Persianate world, right? Where Persian was spoken, you see the prevalence of Persian literature, architectural forms, material culture. Well, the same can be said for India. There is an Indian world, and the Gulf was a part of it. And the Arabian Peninsula was a part of it. And that exhibition looked at that and showed the material aspects of Indian culture that were incorporated into national culture. For example, in winter, you'll see all the nationals, Gulf nationals wear Kashmiri shawl on their head. It's an Arab headdress, but where's Kashmir? It's not in the Arabian Peninsula. So this is an example of how the Gulf was part of this Indian world. And I didn't get any pushback from that. There were no complaints. This was open to the public. Lots of Qataris came to see this exhibition. And people were absolutely fascinated by this because it's not taught in schools. It's not part of the national narrative. And so the response was largely positive. So I think that thanks to the prevalence of the presence of these satellite universities and American affiliated universities, it's created this larger space for academic debate. Many of the graduates from these universities are themselves Gulf nationals who have then gone on to work in government, in the museums, national museums, or in the ministries of culture. And they now have this sort of broader view beyond the national narrative. And so that's created a space to have these sorts of discussions. And so perhaps there's less pushback. There's also the fact that all of this, all these publications are now available online. You don't have to worry about ordering a copy of Archive Wars if you live in Saudi Arabia, and then the government confiscating it at the post office and not giving it to you, because you can just order a copy through Kindle and download it onto your Kindle reader in Riyadh and read it. So the governments can't control the national narrative anymore. So this now is resulting in a transformation of our understanding of the history and heritage and culture of these countries. And new work is coming out, which is portraying the region in a very different way. And I think that a lot of people are really astounded at what is there. It's in many ways the national dress that you see is really a mirage. It's a mask of Arab nationalism, which is disguising the cosmopolitan, the transnational history and heritage that is here. And so this literature is bringing this out, and I think that makes working on the Gulf all the more fascinating. Is that our understanding of this region is still developing, and there's a lot more work to be done. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Dr. Onley, for taking time and discussing this very fascinating issue with us. And this is something which is, I think, personally also, and I think other younger scholars also who would be who were listening to you, I think they would all be inspired by what you have presented, and this will lead to further studies on Gulf and various aspects of Gulf in India and obviously other places as well. May I now request Sir to say the concluding remarks.